Starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of the travel professional community and homebasedtravelagents.com, I want to welcome all of you to this webinar hosted by ARC. My name is Sandy Elson, and I'm very happy to have all of you here, and I thank you all for attending today. Our topic today is the credit card acceptance and fraud prevention best practices, brought to you by ARC. We're very happy to have with us today Jennifer Watkins, Senior Manager, Credit Card Services and Fraud Prevention. Jennifer has over 17 years' experience in the payments and airline industries. Her background includes working with credit card companies, processors, airlines, and travel agents to manage secure and cost-effective payment acceptance and processing. Her current focus at ARC is working with travel agents to manage the risks associated with payment acceptance and therefore reduce fraud in the travel agency distribution channel. And that's something we're all very interested in hearing about today. Before we get started, a reminder that you are all muted, but we do welcome your questions. You can type in your questions at any time in the question area you see on the right-hand panel on your screen. At the end of the webinar, we'll get to as many questions as we can. So I'm going to turn the microphone over to Jennifer so she can get started. I'll be back a few minutes before the end of our time to ask Jennifer your questions. Welcome, Jennifer.
Thank you. Thank you very much for joining the webinar today. Thank you very much for that introduction. I'll start by saying hopefully most of you on the phone have never been hit by fraud, and you may never be hit by fraud, but my goal is to raise your awareness so that you're in the best position to identify it and combat it if it comes your way. So we know that the travel industry in general and travel agents in particular are getting hit hard by fraud. ARC's goal is to provide travel agents with information to help protect your business. So ARC has kicked off a fraud prevention campaign this year. The goal is to reduce fraud in the travel industry through education and collaboration. We believe the key to success is to educate travel agents, and not just ARC travel agents and not just the ones that have access to my ARC system, but the individual agents within an agency, including home-based agents, independent contractors, and any employee that's managing travel. We want to provide information about the tools that are available, provide alerts regarding the latest trends, and we want to work together to identify and stop and convict fraudsters. So we believe this is the key to reducing fraud. A lot of things I talk about are applicable across industries. So whether you're doing service fees or you're doing a hotel or cruise, lots of the information is applicable across industries. Although I've got to say, I think it takes a lot of guts to take a cruise using a fraudulent credit card. So let's move on to what we're going to talk about today. In this session, these are the topics and that we're going to cover. And I'll start by giving a little background about credit card processing, but then we'll jump quickly into the important stuff, which is talking about credit card acceptance in a card not present or non-face-to-face world. I tend to use these terms interchangeably, but they mean the same things: card not present, non-face-to-face. In this session, we'll really focus on the red flags for fraud. We'll talk about the high-risk cities and current trends in fraud schemes. We'll also talk about chargeback management, tips for winning chargebacks. We'll talk a little bit about the credit card chargeback process and some of the tips for responding. Then we'll talk about friendly fraud, how to protect against it, and what you can do when you've been hit by it. And finally, we'll talk about ARC's work with law enforcement and how all of us can get engaged in the industry related to fraud prevention. So to set the stage, just a little history lesson, some quick information about credit card billing for airline tickets, and then some general information about the industry to help set the stage for our session. So what was the first charge card? Well, it looks something like this. And in 1928, a company called Farrington Manufacturing started creating what they called charge plates, and they look like dog tags. And local merchants kept them at their stores and retrieved them when their customers would come into the store. Customers had the option, obviously, to put things on account, and then the account would be paid later. So I grew up in a small town in Wisconsin, and it was not in the 20s, but in the 70s, I actually remember seeing something similar to these in the local department store. Obviously, merchants used this method of extending credit to their customers. They knew their customers. They were willing to take the risk that the customer wouldn't pay because they felt like the risk was low, and it probably was. this is the authorization process, and this is just to sort of set the stage, and I'm going to talk through this really quickly because it's not specific to the fraud, but I think it'll help you understand sort of the process. And when I'm talking about fraud and who the players are in the industry, it'll explain a little bit better. So this shows the authorization process. So when a customer purchases a ticket through a travel agent, regardless of how it's presented, whether it's internet or phone or face-to-face, the card number is entered into the system provider. So Sabre, Travelport, Amadeus. The system providers have linked to the credit card companies, and so for Visa and MasterCard, on the other side of the credit card company, to the far right here, is the issuing bank. In the credit card industry, they're called issuers, and they're the banks that issue credit cards. So for example, I have an American Airlines Citibank card. Other large card issuers include Capital One, Chase, MBNA, Bank of America. We see their commercials on Sunday afternoon football. They do a lot of advertising, it seems like, especially around sports. But in the case of American Express, which is what I have circled here, for American Express, a Discover or UATP card transaction, there generally isn't an issuing bank on the other side. So the authorization process is handled directly. So the entities I've circled here are generally just American Express or Discover or UATP. What the authorization process does is basically validates that the card's active and that the customer has the available credit, or what they call it an open to buy. So obtaining an authorization gives you really very little information about the risk of fraud, and it doesn't provide any protection against fraud chargebacks. I frequently talk to agents who've been hit by fraud that'll say, oh, but I obtained an approval code. It's like, unfortunately, this provides very little, if any, protection. It's still important as the first line of defense, and I'll reference that a little bit more later. So this is the settlement process. It shows the flow of settlements for bank card transactions. And again, bank card transactions are transactions that are issued by banks. So the travel agent takes the transaction, it goes through the system provider. The system provider sends data to ARC every day. Every morning, we take the sales data from the previous day and we create credit card billing files that are output to the airlines, or on behalf of the airlines. I'm sorry, they're not output directly to the airlines, but on behalf of them to the credit card company. Here we show acquiring bank or merchant bank. ARC outputs the transactions to various merchant banks and processors. There's about 25 different processors around the world, and these processors then submit the transaction through Visa or MasterCard, who forwards the transaction to the issuing bank. And there are literally thousands of issuing banks in the US and around the world. And then the issuing bank obviously bills you for the transaction as the cardholder. Next this is the general flow of transactions for American Express and Discover. As you can see, American Express and Discover are generally the issuer of the card, but in recent years they've started to partner with banks to issue cards, but you can see that it's a much more streamlined process. So let's move on to the important stuff and how to manage risk associated with credit card acceptance in the non-face-to-face world. For the very basics, and again, I won't spend a lot of time on this, it's important to validate the credit card types that the carrier accepts. So when you're accepting an airline transaction, most major US carriers accept all of the major credit cards, but we have probably 25 airlines within ARC that don't accept credit cards at all. We work closely with the system providers to make sure our tables are synchronized, but different system providers or GDSs handle things a little bit differently than others, so we have some challenges around that. Prior to accepting the card, disclose the terms and conditions of the sale. So one of the most important terms and conditions that falls into this disclosure is that it's non-refundable. So if you have a non-refundable ticket, make sure the customer knows it's non-refundable. A common chargeback reason is refund not received, and this happens when a customer is unable to take a trip, they can't get a refund, and then they contact their credit card company and say, I thought it was a refundable ticket, and they didn't get the refund. Unfortunately, the card issuer doesn't know whether or not the ticket was non-refundable or refundable, and they also don't know whether or not that information was disclosed to the cardholder. If this were to come back as a chargeback, proof that the terms and conditions were disclosed is going to be required. It generally means that a signature from the customer following clear and concise terms is going to be required. Or if you have a website, it's a click to accept on a website, again, following very clear and concise terms. We'll talk a little bit more about terms and conditions when we talk about chargebacks and the chargeback process. Finally, obtain an authorization through the GDS at the time of ticketing. Now we'll get on to the good stuff. So let's talk about the current environment and managing risk. The credit card companies are clear that it's the responsibility of the entity accepting the card to validate the identity of the cardholder and to ultimately prove that that was done. And this is obviously very difficult in a non-face-to-face environment. Years and years ago, when the credit card companies defined how merchants would prove they validated the identity of a cardholder, they determined that an imprint of the card and a signature on the card or on a charge form would be sufficient proof. Unfortunately, this standard is still applicable to the travel agency distribution. And honestly, I could talk for another hour about the credit card industry, the travel industry, and the work that credit card companies have done to help merchants and how it ties to trends in the travel agency distribution and airline distribution and the challenges we have in the industry. For some of you, I would totally be putting you to sleep. So lucky for you, we don't have enough time to talk about that. So I'm going to move on to what you can do to manage your risk given this constraint. That's exactly what it is. It's about evaluating the risk that the customer is perpetrating fraud and then evaluating your risk tolerance. It's these two pieces. So I know travel agents that require every individual that comes into their agency or every individual or everyone they sell a ticket to come into their office and sign an imprinted charge form. On the far opposite side, I know agents that accept almost every transaction, knowing that a percentage of their transactions will end up as fraud chargebacks and therefore a loss. But because of the volume they do and how they price their product, they're able to take the loss against their revenue. Now, not many agents will do that for a long time, but some agents will at least start out with that. What all merchants, including travel agents, airlines, ticket outlets, and retailers, need to do is find the middle ground where they manage the level of risk they're willing to take. So how do you do this? Believe it or not, the travel industry has been on the cutting edge of evaluating and managing risk in a non-face-to-face environment. Online merchants, of which travel agents were some of the first, got hit hard by fraud initially. Therefore, they developed sophisticated fraud management tools designed to look at hundreds of pieces of data to create a fraud risk score. Transactions that score high are not ticketed or are queued up for manual review. Other merchants have developed homegrown systems that may not be as sophisticated, but were more cost-effective to implement. And that still allowed them to manage to the risk point that they were comfortable with. Still, other merchants have small groups of customers that they work with and feel comfortable with, and that's how they manage their risk. Years ago, I used to tell travel agents the best way to manage your risk is to know your customer. And for lots of travel agents, that still works. So if you know your customer, it's an excellent way to manage your risk. We'll talk a little bit about how fraudsters try to work around that and how you can counteract it when I talk about trends. So let's talk about some of the tools and the pieces of data that are used to manage risk. Address verification service. It validates the elements of the cardholder's, or it validates some elements of the cardholder's address. It is used to verify that the cardholder is who they say they are, and that by validating that they know their address. And so this tool is offered by all the credit card companies and supported by all the system providers. It's a valuable data element to use to evaluate risk, but it doesn't provide an absolute protection in an electronic ticket environment. So when we were with paper tickets, it provides some, and you could provide proof that the tickets were mailed to the address of the cardholder. It provided some protection back then, but in an e-ticket environment, that doesn't exist anymore. The next tool is CID, and it's a tool that validates, I'm sure you're all familiar with it by now because everyone asks for it. It's either the 3 or 4 digits that are unembossed on the back of a Visa, MasterCard, or Discover card, and on the front end of an American Express card. And it's intended to demonstrate that the customer has the card in their possession. So like AVS, all major credit cards have it, and all the system providers support it. As a side note, I can't talk about CID without saying this. The credit card companies are very clear in their message to merchants that the numbers should never be written down or stored in any way. Unfortunately, over the years, this piece of data is sometimes available to fraudsters. Again, it's a valuable piece of data to use to evaluate the risk, but it doesn't offer that shift in liability off of the merchant when they use it. So these two tools are excellent data points to begin to evaluate the risk of fraud. I don't know if there are any agents on the phone that have websites that take payments, but I will share with you that there is one other tool that Visa, MasterCard, and American Express have available. It's called 3D Secure. Visa calls it Verified by Visa. MasterCard calls it MasterCard Secure Code. It's a PIN-based tool that was developed to support internet-only merchants. When 3D Secure is used by an online merchant and the PIN is validated, it does provide a shift in liability. It's important to note it's only for use for internet direct sales. The PIN needs to be entered directly by the consumer. So it's not applicable to other types of non-face-to-face transactions. Again, the good news is that the tool does offer a shift in liability for specific fraud chargebacks. I recently became aware of a couple of online travel agents that are using it, so we're making plans to support it in the industry, but it's going to require changes by the transaction or the agency that has the online presence, the system provider, the GDS, ARC, the credit card processors, but we're looking at making all those changes so it is supported in our industry. So let's move on to, this is really the most important piece of this presentation. This is a list of card not present red flags. And I'm going to talk through them briefly, but focus on the high risk levels. I think this is the information, again, that's going to be most applicable to you. We encourage agents to keep a copy of this at their desk, if for nothing else, but just as a reminder that as you're working with new customers and sort of what the red flags are. The overarching thought here is that if it sounds too good to be true, it probably is. If your gut's telling you something is suspicious, you go with your gut. So let's go through the high risk levels here. First starts with caller ID identifies caller out of area or with no information at all. The fraudsters don't want you to know where they're calling from, so they use tools that don't provide you with information about the call. If there is information about the caller, it can be helpful. So if you're an agency in Milwaukee and you're receiving a call from Miami for a trip from New York to Ghana, why do you think they're calling you? How did they get your number? These guys are very, very good at social engineering, so don't fall for their explanations. Second one, agents are usually contacted for the first time via a website, email, or TTY. So the TTY service is for hearing impaired. They still use this sometimes. It was really prevalent several years ago, but they still use it. Some fraudsters will do what they can to avoid actually having to talk to someone. But recently we've seen fraud that's taking place over the phone, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in the trends. Cardholder is not the passenger. So when using stolen credit cards to purchase tickets, obviously the cardholder isn't going to be involved. So it could be a red flag when the cardholder isn't traveling. Unfortunately, as with several items on this list, the bad guys have identified a workaround. I mean, there is strong evidence that the fraudsters are very familiar with travel and are in our industry. So what they do now is they book a trip for, say, 4 people. One of the passengers will be the name of the cardholder, but only 3 people are going to show up at the airport and fly. So that one ticket just is never going to be used. Credit card, driver's license, passports are faxed or emailed because the cardholder isn't available to come to the agency. Good fraudsters are quite happy to send you copies of passports or credit cards they've created. The challenge is that it can be a good practice to collect all that data to evaluate the risk of the transaction again. So to request passports or driver's license is good, but it's important to look at them and try to validate that they're legitimate. We receive quite a few copies of passports and driver's license in the fraud department here, and we're often amazed at how many bad passports or copies of credit cards we receive or driver's license with spelling errors, incorrect fonts, things like that. Again, I'll talk more about that when we talk about trends. Several tickets are purchased with different routings. So the travel dates and passenger names several tickets are purchased with different routings, travel dates, and passenger names using a single credit card. Some fraud rings purchase tickets using bad credit cards, and then they sell the tickets to other people. This is why the routings for their customers would be different. Customers may use a religious title like pastor or religious premise like they're a missionary or a doctor. This is an oldie but a goodie, and we still see it. Travel agents are there to help, and they want to help even more when their customers are doing sort of rescue work or missionary work. So they're very good at their social engineering tactics. Email requests contain obvious spelling errors. They use airport city codes instead of city names. Like I said, these people work in the industry, so they're very familiar with the airport codes. They provide fictitious addresses and phone numbers in the US. Email address is from a free service. They're constantly setting up new email addresses, and this one has changed a little bit because so many people use free email services for their legitimate personal email accounts. We don't see a lot of legitimate businesses using Gmail accounts, but they do use them for their personal accounts, and most people do. So it's a little bit harder to use this as a fraud detection or a red flag if it's the only thing you're relying on. The customer is new to the agency. It can be either domestic or international travel. The big fraud schemes that we're seeing right now are for international travel, but there are others that work domestically. They're not concerned about the ticket price. Obviously, they're using stolen credit cards, so they don't care how much it costs. Another indicator may be time to departure. It's common for fraudsters to book tickets for same day or next day. Having said that, they found a workaround, which is to book a ticket for a future date, and then they show up at the airport or contact the airline and change it to the same day. Highly flexible travel schedule. When the first credit card is declined, it'll offer another and another. And this is why approval codes are the first line of defense. So it does provide you with some information about the transaction. If you can't get an approval code, it's definitely a red flag. Customers can be contacted only via cell phone within an area code that's not in the same region. I was talking to an agent last week, though, that came across a fraud ring that had people living all over the place. And so they would have the individual calling, for example, if the travel agent's in Boston, they would have someone call from Boston to book the travel. As I mentioned earlier, large online merchants, including travel agents and airlines, use hundreds of pieces of data that they look at to evaluate the risk that a transaction could be fraudulent. Examples of these data elements include these red flags, and they use AVS and CID, but they use many, many more. And so I'll talk a little bit about what some of those other items are that they look at. They may or may not be applicable to agencies who know their customers, or aren't really applicable to agencies who know their customers. But for agents that have a large customer base, these could be helpful. Obviously, if you know your customer, these aren't really going to be relevant. Customer history. You have a positive or a negative experience with the customer. Have they been with you for a long time? Next is negative list. So a negative list includes pieces of data that are tied to fraud. So if you're in a large agency and you experience fraud from time to time, you should have a negative list that you use to bump up against the transactions that you receive. Things that would be on a negative list include like phone numbers that were tied to the fraud, email addresses that were tied to the fraud, names, their addresses, IP addresses. If you're an online travel agency, you can pick up their IP address. Is there an account takeover risk? And it's really only applicable to agents who have websites that require a login. So the question is, what are the chances that the account's been taken over by a fraudster? Did the password just change? Are they using a different computer or IP address than usual? That helps you identify whether or not there's a risk that that account has been taken over. Billing information, we talked about AVS. If you're collecting the customer billing and shipping address information, do they match each other? And do they match the address with the credit card company? Itinerary. There are several high-risk cities, including like Accra, Ghana, Abidjan, which is in the Ivory Coast, Casablanca, and depending on your clients and your business model, you may know that any itinerary that originates outside the U.S. is suspect, depending on what kind of travel you're managing. Again, you may, depending on your clients, you may know that any itinerary that originates from a location that's not near you may be suspect. Obviously, if you have a website and it's open to anyone, the origin of the trip may not be valuable. However, you may want to look at the address of the customer to determine if it sounds reasonable. For example, I live in Washington, D.C. I could fly out of DCA, BWI, or Dulles. What I almost never do is fly on an itinerary that originates in Indianapolis or really any other city. Having said that, later this month I have a meeting in Los Angeles, so I had our corporate travel department book my trip to Los Angeles. And then rather than returning from Los Angeles, I decided to meet with some friends in Chicago, so I used my own travel agency to book a flight from Los Angeles to Chicago. So that Los Angeles to Chicago trip, because my travel agent didn't know that I was flying to Los Angeles, so that trip is out of the norm from my usual activity and what could be suspect by that agency. So it's hard to come up with hard and fast rules. But what could have happened on that ticket is that the agency could have called me and said, hey, this is outside your normal pattern. Is this correct? I did not get that call. So I'm hoping that my flight from LA to Chicago is good to go. For your new customers, as I described, you could use their address to identify whether or not the itinerary makes sense. So if they're flying from an airport that's near their address, that's going to be helpful. For a travel agency that does local business, again, is the customer calling you and booking a ticket from a distant airport? How did they get in touch with your agency? This could fall into the category of, yeah, if it sounds too good to be true, you might not want to do it. I also want to make the point that behavior of fraudsters could match closely to the behavior of some of your best customers. So, for example, immediate travel, not concerned about the price, they know the airport city codes, they book travel for other people are not always included on the itinerary. So a couple years ago, I bought some close friends tickets from Indianapolis to Las Vegas for their wedding, and this raised a red flag for the agent, and they called me. The challenge in managing risk is also balancing that against insulting your good customers. So as you can see, for many of these pieces of data I mentioned, we can see where the trends have changed. Like I said, we used to be able to say that the same day or next day travel was a big red flag. But then we started to see where tickets were purchased for future travel but changed. Another example I mentioned is passenger name, cardholder name match. This was a red flag, but the fraudsters have found a workaround. Just want to reinforce the point that the fraudsters are always changing, and new tools to identify them are changing too. And large merchants have some sophisticated tools like device fingerprinting. This looks at elements of specific computer to tie it to a customer. It helps show that the customer is using their own computer to initiate the transactions. Years ago, merchants started looking at IP addresses, and depending on the merchant, they might say, I'm not going to take an IP address that originates in a high-risk area like West Africa or China or Russia. So what did the bad guys do? They came up with a tool to emulate IP addresses so it looks like they're dialing in from a different location. Like I said, another big red flag is itinerary, and so we've identified several high-risk cities. I'm not going to read through all these. Most of them are in Africa, but there are a few in Asia. We've seen, I mean, it doesn't include all of them, but these are the main ones that we see a lot of active fraud rings like to travel to these locations. Recently, there's been a very active fraud ring out of Peru, but they like to book trips to South America. They'll pose as a band or as a record label, moving people around, or an entertainment company, and book travel for the band all over the world, but it often touches South America and Colombia specifically. So that's one of the most active fraud rings we have going on right now. Back to this list, I talked to an agency recently who had a customer that traveled legitimately to many of these cities on the list. Again, the challenge is sometimes weighing what's your best customers and what their behaviors are against what the fraudsters' behaviors are. So I'm going to talk about some of the current fraud trends we're seeing. Many of these, I should say, if any of these sound familiar to you, call ARC. I'll give you the contact information at the end of this presentation, but if any of this sounds familiar, let us know. The first category of fraud we're going to talk about is social engineering. And so I've referenced social engineering many times so far. So what is it? It's when the fraudsters use their social skills to manipulate people to get what they want. The fraudsters are very good at relationship building and social engineering. They will contact an agent and start to build a relationship. They may start by purchasing what we call a straw purchase, for example, from DC to Nashville. Sounds reasonable, right? Then maybe they start then the next one is DC to Miami, and they continue to build that relationship, and before you know it, they're booking tickets from Miami to Accra, Ghana. And in the end, all of the transactions are going to come back as fraud chargebacks. Another type of relationship building is to say that a friend recommended you. They'll say, yes, I got your name from my friend Jody Anderson, and she suggested I contact you to get your help with my trip to Africa. This is where it can get challenging when you work only with people that you know. You may have long-standing relationships with your customers, and one of them recommends you to a friend. I mean, this is normal, right? The challenge is that it's so easy to get information about you and your friends. If you don't have your Facebook page restricted, they can see all your friends and your posts. They look up on the internet to find out who your neighbor is. They take this information and they use it against you. So how can you prevent this from happening? First, if you don't want the world to see what you're doing, make sure your Facebook page is restricted. And manage what your Facebook friends can post about you. In addition, think about how you want to manage your LinkedIn account. Second, when you receive a call from a new customer that was referred to you by a friend, you may want to call the friend just to make sure that that's true. A third social engineering scheme is a new company contacts you because they want you to manage their travel. This is an example of a website that a fraudster created to attempt to legitimize their company and support this scheme. They contact travel agents to request that they handle the travel for their company. The agent's excited because they've got a new customer. They do some research to validate the company's good. The company has a web page. It all looks legitimate. These scammers actually found an agent in the Midwest who started ticketing 3 days after this web domain was created. By the time the agency received the first chargeback, they'd done over $80,000 in transaction. This particular group specialized in travel to and from Colombia. Again, this is one example, but there are several schemes where they pose as a corporation or a convention and visitors bureau or a university. They contact an agency under the guise of looking for a new agency to handle all of their travel. A related scheme is to pose, like I said, as a university and establish that relationship. Universities generally have email domains that end in .edu. What the bad guys will do is they'll use an email domain that says something like xuniversity-edu.com. So they've made it look like a legitimate email address from a university. And if you're not paying really close attention, you're going to say, oh yeah, that looks like a legitimate email address from a university. So the key is to make sure when you're working with your customers that the email addresses make sense. Like I said, this has been a big problem recently, and we've seen several agents get hit. We had one related situation where a large corporation was purchased by a Chinese company. The agency that had the established working relationship with this corporation was contacted by the new owners. Of course, the agency was aware of the acquisition, so they began working with the new owners. Turns out it wasn't really the new owners, but fraudsters posing as the new owners, and the agent started ticketing the transactions, and they ended up being fraud. In that case, we were really lucky because ARC was able to identify the fraud really early on. We reached out to the agency, and the agency told us their story, and we're like, are you sure? Are you sure? And after they looked at it a little bit harder, they're like, oh my gosh, these look like fraud. So that was ended up being a good story. Now we're going to talk about phishing emails and unauthorized ticketing scheme. Hopefully, all of you are well aware of this. ARC has sent many alerts about this over the last several years, and this is an example of a phishing email. They're phishing for your system provider login credentials. The email generally looks like it's coming from a system provider, an airline, or a booking tool. Last week, we saw 4 different phishing emails that went out to travel agents. So one of the challenges for the travel industry, for you guys, is that you're busy. You're multitaskers. Maybe you're expecting an email confirmation, you're on the phone talking to one client, meanwhile you pull up the email confirmation, click on the link, takes you to the system provider login page, you log in to get your confirmation information, and what just happened is that you thought you were logging into the system provider, but the fraudsters just collected your credentials. And the challenge is that the agent doesn't even know what happened. So, I mean, I'm telling you, this happens to good, smart agents. The best way to avoid this happening to you is never click on a link in an email and log into your system provider. And this goes for your work life and your personal life. Don't click on links in emails from your bank or anyone and log in. And if you inadvertently do it and then realize it afterwards, change your passwords. So what do they do after they have your credentials? They log in using your credentials, generally on a weekend, and they book tickets. And by the time you've realized it, or that the owner or manager has realized it, the tickets have been flown. The industry has seen great success actually this year with voiding the tickets before they were flown. I mean, we've gotten a pretty good handle on how this works. But again, we see this happen every week. Last week we had 4 incidents. This scheme came out of West Africa, and here are Fulgence Bahi and Herman Dudu. We're very excited in June of last year to work with federal law enforcement to get these 2 guys put behind bars in the Ivory Coast. They face a possible 20 years in prison. And let me tell you, prison in the Ivory Coast is not like prison in the U.S. But immediately following their arrest, the phishing emails and unauthorized ticketing incident stops. Unfortunately, it appears they've trained someone because we're continuing to see these unauthorized ticketing incidents again. So ARC is very active with law enforcement, and at any one time, we're putting together between 20 and 25 cases. We have close relationships with federal, state, and local, and international law enforcement. We're passionate about catching the bad guys, and the information we receive from travel agents about the fraud you've experienced is key to our efforts. So if you experience fraud, please contact the ARC Fraud Prevention Team. And I'm going to give you the email address. I'll show it again at the end. But it's FIFP, Fraud Information and Fraud Prevention, FIFP at ARCcorp, ARCcorp.com. And we don't care if you're an ARC agent or not. We're happy to help in any way we can. So don't worry, oh, I'm not an ARC agent, I can't call ARC. We're happy to have you call us. Another trend we're seeing is to use titles to help legitimize themselves. This is an interesting website we saw. We call this case the Accra Pipeline case. They like to use this technique where they are a church or a mission or something like that. But they also use other techniques to convince travel agents to sell them their tickets. This is a website they put together to attempt to legitimize their efforts. This is just the main page. It appears to be under construction, so if you click on any of the links, it doesn't go anywhere. So they're really just creating sort of a shell of a web page. In the Accra Pipeline case, the fraudsters used many techniques, like I said. There are several strange things, though, when you look at this web page, and I'll highlight a couple. First is a phone number. It is in a U.S. format. And if you look up this phone number on whitepages.com, it's actually a MagicJack number. So MagicJack is a company that supports voice over IP. It's an internet-based phone. If you're suspicious, I suggest whitepages.com is a great way to look up phone numbers. There's spelling errors like church groups. That's not really how a church group would put that up there. These fraudsters are happy to provide passports and copies of credit cards upon request. So here are a couple examples of the passports they've used. The passport on the right is the template they use to create their fictitious passports. These 2 gentlemen we've seen several times over the year as travel agents have sent us documentation they received. They have different names and birth dates. But if you see these 2 pictures on a passport, let us know and don't be ticketing for them. So what else looks strange on these passports? For example, the background compared to the print. A normal passport doesn't have such a big contrast in the background to the print. If you need help validating a passport or a driver's license or ID, a tool is available called the ID Checking Guide. If you're suspicious, you can always call the ARC Fraud Prevention Team and they'll help you with this. I am running out of time. So I'm gonna skip. This is the guy we caught as part of the Aker pipeline. Other schemes, because I think this is really important, let's move on to, this is another scheme that was a corporate type scheme, and I don't think you guys are all that involved in corporate type schemes. We have seen some independent contractor fraud where an independent contractor comes into an agency, they start getting the ability to ticket, and they start using fraudulent credit cards, and by the time the owner realizes what's happened, there are chargebacks coming back, and sometimes they're very significant. We actually have had a couple of arrests and convictions in LA for independent contractor frauds. And I've already really talked about the corporate scheme. So let's talk about chargebacks. So these are the entities that are involved in chargebacks. Let's talk about what you should do when you receive a chargeback. Contact the customer and explain the charge. It's possible there's confusion. If there's been a misunderstanding, request that they contact the credit card company to rescind the chargeback or the inquiry. And even if the customer says they're going to contact the credit card company, respond to the chargeback and do it quickly. There are tight time frames around chargeback management, so it's important to respond quickly. If this is a true fraud situation, there isn't a whole lot that you're going to be able to do, but if you think it might be friendly fraud, and let me move on a little bit to friendly fraud here. This is fraud that occurs when the customer is someone known to you. Often they actually took the trip. They contact their credit card company because they want to charge the transaction back. In the U.S., we have something called the Fair Credit Billing Act, and the Fair Credit Billing Act says that we as consumers have the right to charge back transactions that we were not involved in. And so that means that there are times when we're going to have to deal with friendly fraud situations where someone has buyer's remorse, there's a dispute over whether it was a refundable or a non-refundable ticket, or maybe they just don't have the money to pay anymore, so they're going to contact their credit card company and charge back the transaction. This is what friendly fraud is. And the best thing to do is respond to the chargeback with all the evidence you have. Include a letter, include all the ticket information, what your experience was with the customer, and then there's a possibility that the transaction will be reversed. The chargeback will be reversed, and so you won't be absorbing the loss for that. If you find that you can't get that chargeback reversed, there's a company called iCore that will do collection for you. This is iCore's contact information. Daryl Hewson is in charge of that. Contact him if you need help doing collections. We're not collection agents. iCore can help you, and the benefit with iCore is that they will help you collect a small amount of money if you tell them that you have an association with ARC. And you don't have to be an ARC agent to say you have an association with ARC in this case. Again, ARC works with law enforcement quite a bit. We work with the Merchant Risk Council. Airline Information is an organization that does great events around fraud prevention. And this is the contact information for the fraud prevention team. ARC also has a travel agency service fee program. If you want to drive service fees, you can use ARC's program. The TAF team is really committed to helping support our industry when chargebacks come in. So reach out to them if you would like to charge your customers with service fees. And again, there's my email address if you want to contact me directly. I have gone over my time.
Jennifer, thank you so much. This was a lot of really valuable information, and best evidence of that is that we have a lot of questions. We will get to a few of them, but I urge everybody who's listening to the webinar to contact Jennifer if you have other questions or if you have questions that we don't get to today. So let's get started with some of the questions. Is there a card, a new card, which does not imprint on a UCC form, and someone sitting in the office, how do we handle that?
Yes, so the challenge with there are unembossed cards out there now. Most merchants swipe a card. So Airline or travel agents are about the only entities that don't have card swipe readers in their offices. So these cards were designed to support card swipe reads. It's going to have to be up to you to decide whether or not you're willing to take the risk that that transaction could come back as fraud, and then decide whether or not you want to ask for a different form of payment or take that card. Unfortunately, that's the situation with those cards. We may end up seeing more of that in the industry, but travel agents don't have card swipe readers in their offices because most of the transactions are non-face-to-face.
Okay, yeah, there's a lot of non-face-to-face charging going on out there in all industries.
Yeah.
We had a question, will emailing a confirmation to a client, including terms and conditions, and requiring acceptance of the itinerary, confirming it, and confirming the charges that are being sent to the credit card company, and have an email coming back authorizing those charges, will any of that hold up in the event of a chargeback?
So that's a great practice. I think it's a great practice to help protect yourselves and manage the risk. The challenge is the credit card companies, when they're trying to make their determination about whether or not that's fraud, is going to want to know, is that email address tied to that cardholder's account? So if they can look at that cardholder's account and they can validate that that correspondence going back and forth was their customer, then that would be what's called compelling evidence. And again, it's up to the credit card company to make the determination about whether or not that's proof that that customer was involved in the transaction. To me, that sounds like compelling evidence, but I'm not the one that's making the decision.
Okay, but that's a good practice in any case, just to
Yeah.
have that. Is there any liability to an agency for simply passing along a credit card number to a vendor? I know that's how cruise lines work. You just give them the credit card number for the client, and it's the cruise line that actually processes the charge. Is the agency liable for that transaction?
You know, I'm not exactly sure how it works with cruise lines. Again, I don't think credit card fraud's as prevalent on cruise lines, just because I think it takes a lot of guts to get on a cruise when you used a bad credit card. I'm not sure if the cruise lines shift that liability back to you as the travel agent or not. I'm not familiar enough with the cruise industry.
Okay, we have a question about the many phishing emails that we all get. Do standard security tools such as Norton help with supplier phishing frauds? Does ARC update the information to companies like Norton?
Phishing emails, so Norton is an antivirus software and McAfee
Yes.
would be another one.
Right.
And so what we are seeing is some of these phishing emails that have malware on them, and the malware is designed to do keystroke logging and allow them to remote access your computer. We haven't seen a lot of this, but when we have seen it, those tools, McAfee and Norton, are initially not very good at detecting them, but we work closely with the GDSs, and the GDSs will go back to those providers with that information, yes.
Okay.
ARC doesn't work directly with them, but the GDSs do.
Okay. And the information you've given about sending fraud information back to ARC, is that valid for non-U.S. agencies as well?
Yeah, we will work with non-U.S. agencies. We've been to a couple of fraud meetings in Canada specifically. We have tried to work with IATA, who are our counterparts internationally. They don't have really the resources to focus on fraud prevention. But we do work with them, and we do try to help all the agents. It's the same fraudsters that are hitting everyone.
Right. Right. We have a couple of questions about ICOR. Can you display the ICOR slide again if you have it available? And how does ICOR help with these situations?
So when you have a friendly fraud situation, and this is a customer that you've known, it's a guy who booked a trip for he and his girlfriend, and then they split up, and he doesn't want to take the trip, so he decides to contact his credit card company and claim that he didn't authorize those transactions. It's that type of situation. There's many flavors of sort of friendly fraud. And so now you're going to absorb the loss for that potentially, and what you need to do is pursue that guy and say, hey, you knew you were buying a ticket that was non-refundable. You need to pay me for this ticket. And so I-Court does collections, basically, because we're not collection agents. They do collections, and they will help you, based on the information you have about your customer, collect from that customer.
Okay. Thank you. We've had a lot of questions about whether this webinar is being recorded for future reference, and the answer is yes. We are recording it, and it will be available on the travel professional community in the webinar archives group. So look for it there. In a couple of days, we'll make an announcement when it's available. There's so much information here, Jennifer, that it's something that people are going to want to look at over and over again.
Yeah, and I talked really fast. I know I did.
Well, you had a lot of territory to cover. Let's see if we can get to another couple of questions. One question is, how does ARC protect the agent partners from fraud?
So we have a fraud team here that we monitor certain fraud trends. We know who some of the fraudsters are. We know how they behave, and we get a lot of data from the GDSs every day. So we look at the data to try to identify when a travel agency is being hit by fraud. And I mentioned the one agency that started work with the Chinese, quote, corporation. And we identified that pretty quickly because we had seen that trend and that exact behavior in travel that was fraud, and an agency had contacted us about that. And when we saw it happening again, we were able to contact the agency and say, hey, these look suspicious to us. Now, we can't catch everything because it's a lot of data, and we don't have enough information about, what scheme they're perpetrating. Are they doing social engineering? We don't know because we're not obviously the point of sale. All we have is ticket data to look at to try to identify it.
Okay. Let's see. We have a question about, do you have any advice for agencies who do get a chargeback? How could they try to recoup the money that was lost in a fraud?
Yeah, if it's a true fraud chargeback where it's a fraud ring that's stole someone's credit card and are using that, it's going to be, I don't have any advice for how to collect that money. The fraudster perpetrated fraud. The cardholder is not going to be on the hook for that transaction. If you think it's friendly fraud where the customer actually did take the trip, then provide the support that I outlined, with a letter and details of all the transaction information to the airline or to your credit card company, or if it's a service fee, to ARC, and try to get the chargeback reversed. If it's true fraud, if you've been hit by true fraud where they're flying to West Africa and they stole someone's credit card to purchase the ticket, there's not a way to recoup that money.
Okay. And are most of the frauds airline charges, or is there fraudulent behavior for other types of travel activity?
Oh, I think there's fraud for other types of travel activity as well. I mean, I hear from hotels and car rental agencies and even cruise lines, although again, I don't know. I don't think cruise lines probably experience it as heavily as other industries, but the travel industry sees a lot of fraud. Like I said, the Merchant Risk Council we work with, there's over 1,000 agents that participate in the Merchant Risk Council. The fraudsters hit everyone from Walmart, Kmart, American Airlines, Delta, Ticketmaster, StubHub. They hit everyone. So it's up to all those entities to try to keep them out the best they can.
And if an agency is a victim of fraud, does their errors and omission insurance help with the chargebacks?
I don't believe so. I haven't heard of an errors or an omissions insurance that covers that.
We have a question. How do you work with suppliers to red flag passengers who have been using stolen credit cards?
When we identify fraud, we will contact the airline and say these tickets have been purchased using a stolen credit card. There are some challenges from a legal perspective to airlines. Airlines can interview passengers, or law enforcement in an airport can interview passengers, but they can't deny boarding. The challenge is a lot of the people who are flying on these stolen credit cards don't know that they're flying on stolen credit cards. And so there's some legislation around how airlines can handle that.
Okay, excellent answers. We've had some requests to redisplay the steps to do if you think you're a victim of fraud. Do you have that one handy?
I guess this is a chargeback.
Yeah, the chargeback.
Probably responding to a chargeback. Yeah, contact the customer. And I'm happy, if you want to reach out to me, I'm happy to forward this presentation to anyone. Again, the red flags guide and maybe the high-risk cities is helpful to have at your desk or at any travel agency's desk, any travel agent's desk.
Okay, that's great. And also, as I said, this recording of this whole webinar will be available soon for everyone's information as well. And Jennifer, could you put your contact information back up on the screen for us as well?